The cold was the first thing that registered. Not the biting chill of the Los Angeles winter outside, but the manufactured, sterile cold of the showroom floor. It seeped through the soles of my boots, a stark contrast to the aggressive gleam of polished chrome and lacquered paint under recessed lighting. The air smelled of money, a cloying mix of new leather, expensive German air freshener, and something else, something like condescension. I ran a hand over the cool, obsidian flank of a sedan that cost more than my entire freelance career had earned me to date. My name is Nia, and for the last 2 years, since I'd aged out of the system, I'd been clawing my way to stable ground as a graphic designer. Late nights fueled by cheap coffee, chasing invoices, building a portfolio 1 pixel at a time. It was finally paying off. I had a major client, a retainer, and a need for a car that wouldn't die on the freeway on my way to a meeting. Something safe. Something that said I was reliable. My gray wool shirt and dark blue jeans, my standard uniform for a day of running errands between projects, suddenly felt like a costume for a pauper. I could feel the eyes on me. Not the curious glances of other customers, but the sharp, dismissive appraisal of the sales staff. They moved like sharks in tailored suits, circling the older couples and the men with expensive watches, leaving me in an invisible, isolated current. "Can I help you?" The voice was smooth, but the tone was anything but helpful. I turned. The man was tall, with perfectly coiffed hair, and a smile that didn't touch his eyes. His name tag read Mr. Davies, showroom manager. He wasn't looking at me, but rather through me, his gaze flicking over my clothes with an almost comical level of disdain. "I'm just looking," I said, my voice steady. I refused to be intimidated. I'd dealt with worse than a snooty car salesman. "Of course," he said, the smile tightening. "The models in this section start at 90,000. Perhaps something pre-owned would be more suitable." He gestured vaguely toward a distant corner of the lot, a graveyard of trade-ins. The insult was so blatant, so lazily delivered, it was almost stunning. I felt a familiar heat crawl up my neck, the old defensive anger that had kept me safe for years. I had the down payment in my bank account. I had the credit score. I had done the work. "I know what they start at," I said, my voice dropping a little, gaining a harder edge. "I'm interested in the safety ratings for the G-Wagon." Mr. Davies actually blinked, a flicker of surprise before the sneer settled back into place. "The G-Wagon is a very particular vehicle, for a very particular clientele." "And I'm not it?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air between us. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a small step closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be humiliating. "Listen, we're very busy today. If you're not here to make a serious inquiry, I'm going to have to ask you to continue your window shopping elsewhere." That was it. The final, perfectly polished nail in the coffin of my patience. I looked from his smug face to the gleaming car, then back again. I thought of the all-nighter I'd pulled to finish the branding package that had secured the funds for this very purchase. I thought of every time I'd been underestimated, dismissed, and told I didn't belong. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked away. I could feel his satisfied smirk on my back all the way to the heavy glass doors. The cold afternoon air that hit my face felt like a relief, washing away the showroom's sterile chill. Humiliation burned in my gut, hot and acidic. It wasn't just about the car. It was the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I was nothing. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, the manager's dismissive tone echoing in my head. It was one more reminder that the world was always ready to put you in a box based on what you looked like. The arrangement with Kwon Ji-hoon was supposed to be my escape from that. A marriage in name only, a contract signed to merge his family's influence with a tech firm my estranged father had a stake in. It was a business deal. I got a trust fund that would let me build my design business without fear of eviction, and he got a piece of a legitimate empire. We lived in the same house, a minimalist penthouse in Koreatown that felt more like a museum than a home, but we existed in separate orbits. He was a ghost in a tailored suit, a presence I felt more than saw. A man of deep silences and unsettling stillness. In the 3 weeks since the quiet courthouse ceremony, we had exchanged maybe 50 words. He was my husband, but he was a stranger. A dangerous one. I knew what he was, what his family did. I just chose not to look too closely. It was a price I was willing to pay for freedom. The next morning, the doorbell chimed through the penthouse, a sound so rare it made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. Ji-hoon was gone before I ever woke up and returned long after I'd retreated to my studio. I pulled on a robe and padded to the door, peering through the security camera. A man in a black suit stood in the hallway. He looked like every other man who flanked Ji-hoon, impeccable, impassive, built like a wall of muscle. I recognized him as Mr. Choi, Ji-hoon's head of security. I opened the door. "Ma'am," he said, his head bowing a fraction of an inch. He never called me by my name. No one in this world did. "Mr. Kwon sent this for you." He stepped aside, and my breath caught in my throat. Down in the private garage, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby, was a car. It wasn't just any car. It was a G-Wagon. Not the one from the showroom floor, but its twin. It was a monstrous, beautiful beast of a vehicle, painted in a matte black that seemed to absorb the light around it. It looked less like a car and more like a military-grade weapon. Parked directly behind it was a flatbed truck from the very dealership I had been kicked out of. And standing beside the G-Wagon, looking pale and profoundly uncomfortable, was Mr. Davies. My heart started a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I looked back at Mr. Choi. His face was a perfect, unreadable mask. "The keys, ma'am," he said, holding out a small, heavy black box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single key fob. "And Mr. Kwon has requested that the dealership manager offer you a personal apology." My eyes drifted back to the garage. Mr. Davies was sweating, his expensive suit looking rumpled and cheap in the harsh morning light. He was staring up at me, his mouth slightly agape, a look of dawning horror on his face. This was not a gift. It was a message. A display of power so absolute, so surgical, it made the air feel thin. Ji-hoon hadn't been there. I hadn't told him where I was going. How did he know? The question was naive. He knew everything. He had people, resources, a web of influence I couldn't begin to comprehend. He had seen my humiliation without me saying a word and had responded with overwhelming, terrifying force. That was the moment everything changed. The invisible line between his world and mine dissolved. He had reached across that divide and pulled me in, chaining me to him not with a contract, but with an act of possessive retribution. I took the box from Mr. Choi, the cold metal of the key fob a heavy weight in my palm. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about a claim. And I had no idea what it would cost me. I didn't go down to the garage. I didn't want to see Mr. Davies grovel. The thought of it turned my stomach. It was a victory that tasted like ash. I simply nodded to Mr. Choi, closed the door, and leaned against it, my legs suddenly weak. An hour later, Ji-hoon came home. He never came home in the middle of the day. His presence filled the cavernous, empty space of the penthouse instantly. The air shifted, growing heavier, charged with a silent energy. I was in my studio, a converted spare bedroom with a view of the sprawling city, trying to focus on a logo design. But my hands were unsteady, my mind replaying the scene in the garage. He didn't knock. He just appeared in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the light of the hallway. He was in one of his immaculate suits, a charcoal gray Tom Ford that probably cost more than my first car. His tie was loosened, the top button of his stark white shirt undone, the only sign of disorder I had ever seen on him. "You didn't accept the apology," he said. It wasn't a question. I turned in my chair, my heart rate kicking up. His eyes, a dark, impenetrable brown, were fixed on me. They were the kind of eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away. "No," I said quietly. He walked into the room, his movements economical and precise. He moved like the room owed him space. He stopped in front of my desk, looking down at the tablet where my half-finished design glowed. He didn't comment on it. His focus was entirely on me. He disrespected you, Ji-hoon stated, his voice a low, level baritone. There was no anger in it, just a flat statement of fact. That is the same as disrespecting me. So you terrorized him? The words were out before I could stop them. They sounded sharper than I intended. A flicker of something, surprise? Amusement, crossed his face before it was gone. I acquired an asset and corrected a mistake. The method was efficient. Efficient, I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. He looked like he was going to be sick. He is unimportant, Ji-hoon said, dismissing the man's entire existence with 3 words. He leaned forward, placing his hands on my desk, caging me in. The faint scent of his cologne, something clean and sharp like cedar and smoke, reached me. It was subtle, but absolute. What is important is that it will not happen again. No one will look at you that way again. That was the re-hook. The moment I understood the depth of the water I was in. This wasn't about protecting my feelings. This was about his honor, his territory. I was now part of that territory, an asset to be protected and controlled. The G-Wagon in the garage wasn't a gift for me. It was a warning to everyone else. I could have handled it myself, I said, lifting my chin. It was a weak protest, and we both knew it. His gaze intensified. For the first time, I saw something behind the cold, tactical mask. A shadow of something old and painful. The last woman I failed to protect is dead. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and shocking in its simplicity. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to me. It explained the walls around him, the chilling control, the violent response to a perceived threat against me. It was his wound, the one vulnerability he carried, and he had just shown it to me. Before I could process it, his phone buzzed on his hip, a low, insistent vibration. He straightened up, the mask of the impassive boss snapping back into place. He answered, speaking in rapid, hushed Korean. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was urgent, lethal. He hung up and looked at me, his eyes dark with a new, immediate danger. We have to leave. Now. There was no time to pack, no time to think. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled me from the chair. Mr. Choi and another guard were already at the door, their faces grim, guns visible in shoulder holsters under their jackets. This was real. The abstract danger I had chosen to ignore was now standing in my apartment. I had a choice. A split-second window. I could scream, refuse, make a scene. I could try to run. But looking at the cold certainty in Ji-hoon's eyes, I knew it was pointless. More than that, a different, more pragmatic instinct took over. The danger was here, with him. Running away from him now would be like running into the fire. I made a deliberate choice. I didn't pull away. I let him lead me toward the service elevator, my mind racing. I stayed. We rode down in silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. In the garage, the matte black G-Wagon waited, looking even more menacing up close. Mr. Choi got in the driver's seat, another guard in the passenger side. Ji-hoon opened the back door for me, his body shielding mine as I slid onto the plush leather seat. He got in beside me, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that sealed us inside. As we pulled out of the garage into the bright LA daylight, I noticed a black sedan pull out from across the street, 2 cars behind us. It was discreet, but its movements were too deliberate, too perfectly timed with ours. Is that? I started to ask, my voice barely a whisper. Ji-hoon didn't even look. His eyes were on the rearview mirror, but his focus seemed to be miles away. Yes, the danger wasn't just an idea anymore. It had a face, it had a car, and it was following us. He saw me watching the sedan in the side mirror, my knuckles white where I gripped the door handle. They will not get close, he said, his voice a low rumble beside me. It was meant to be reassuring, but it sounded like a promise of violence. I made myself breathe. Competence under pressure. That was my survival skill. Panicking was a luxury I couldn't afford. I focused on the sedan, memorizing its features. No front plate, tinted windows, A small dent on the rear passenger door. Details. Information was power. Ji-hoon noticed my focus. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on me. The space between us and the back of the SUV felt charged, a pocket of intense silence in a world that was suddenly moving too fast. His hand, which had been resting on the seat between us, lifted slightly, as if to touch my arm, before he seemed to think better of it and clenched it into a fist. It was a small, almost deniable gesture of aborted comfort. The first charged moment. Proximity, eye contact, and a silence that said more than words ever could. In that moment, he wasn't just the cold, calculating mafia boss. He was a man with a ghost in his past, trying to keep the present from turning into another tragedy. And I was the woman sitting next to him, no longer an ordinary person, but a piece on his bloody chessboard. We ended up at a warehouse in the industrial district, a place of corrugated steel and anonymity. Inside, it was a different world. A command center buzzed with quiet activity. Men in suits spoke in low tones, screens glowed with security feeds, and the air smelled of ozone and gun oil. Ji-hoon led me to a small, Spartan office in the back. "Stay here. Do not open the door for anyone but me or Mr. Choi." He left before I could answer. I was alone, the muffled sounds of his empire operating just outside the door. I sank onto the stiff leather couch, my mind a whirlwind. I replayed his words in my head. The last woman I failed to protect is dead. My curiosity, a trait that had gotten me into trouble more than once, took over. The office was his. A large oak desk dominated the room. It was neat, almost sterile, except for a single locked drawer. It was an old-fashioned lock, the kind a paperclip could open. I knew I shouldn't. It was a violation of the fragile, unspoken truce between us. But I had to know. I had to understand the world I had just been irrevocably dragged into. My fingers, nimble from years of detailed design work, made short work of the lock. It clicked open softly. Inside there was only one thing. Not a weapon, not a file filled with dark secrets, but a photograph. It was a picture of Ji-hoon, younger, his face softer, a genuine smile on his lips. Beside him was a woman with kind eyes and a laugh that seemed to light up the frame. They were on a beach somewhere, looking happy and carefree. On the back, in elegant script, was a name and a date from 5 years ago. That was the re-hook, the woman he failed to protect. Seeing her face, seeing his smile, made him real in a way he had never been before. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man who had once loved and lost. It made him infinitely more dangerous. A sudden commotion from outside snapped me back to the present. Shouts. The sharp, terrifying crack of gunfire. My blood ran cold. I slammed the drawer shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I scrambled to the door, pressing my ear against the cold steel. More shots, closer this time. The disciplined hum of the command center had devolved into chaos. They were here. The men in the black sedan. The door handle rattled. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. "Mia." It was Ji-hoon's voice, strained, urgent. I fumbled with the lock and threw the door open. He stood there, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with a slash of crimson on his side. His face was pale, but his eyes were blazing with a lethal fire. In his hand was a gun, held with a familiarity that was terrifying. "We have to go." "The roof," he gritted out, grabbing my hand. He pulled me through the chaos. 2 of his men lay on the floor, still and silent. The screens that had shown security feeds were now shattered, sparking. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. This was his world, stripped of its tailored suits and quiet authority. It was blood and noise and death. He was moving fast, but his injury was slowing him down. He stumbled, hissing in pain. The men who had ambushed us were closing in. We were trapped in a long corridor leading to the stairwell. Without thinking, I acted. I saw a heavy metal fire extinguisher on the wall. While Ji-hoon returned fire, providing cover, I grabbed it. It was heavier than I expected. I swung it with all my might into the electrical panel on the wall. Sparks erupted, and the lights in the corridor flickered and died, plunging us into near darkness. Chaos turned to our advantage. In the confusion, Ji-hoon shoved me toward the stairwell. "Go!" I ran, his footsteps close behind me. We burst onto the flat, gravel-covered roof, the night sky and the city lights a dizzying panorama. A helicopter was already descending, its blades whipping the air into a frenzy. Mr. Choi was waving us forward. We were almost there when a figure emerged from behind an air conditioning unit. He was holding a gun, aimed directly at me. Everything slowed down. I saw the man's face, the glint of the barrel, the moment he started to squeeze the trigger. Ji-hoon moved. He threw himself in front of me, a human shield. A deafening bang echoed across the rooftop, and I felt him flinch, his body absorbing the impact. He didn't fall. He raised his own weapon and fired twice. The other man crumpled to the ground. The moment one of them almost loses the other. He had taken a bullet for me. Mr. Choi and another guard reached us, half dragging, half carrying Ji-hoon toward the helicopter. I scrambled in after them, my hands shaking, my mind numb with shock. As we lifted off, leaving the chaos behind, I looked at him. He was slumped against the seat, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. The red stain on his side was spreading, and there was another, darker one on his shoulder.
He had saved me.
Now it was my turn to save him back. The helicopter took us to another one of his properties, a sleek, modern house nestled in the Hollywood Hills. It was a safe house, equipped with a medical room that looked better stocked than a small clinic. While Mr. Choi stood guard, I went to work. My hands, which had been shaking, were now steady. I had learned basic first aid in the group homes, a necessity for survival. I cut away his ruined shirt. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, but the wound on his side was uglier, a deep graze that was bleeding profusely. I cleaned the wounds, my touch gentle but efficient, my mind focused solely on the task. I was packing the gash on his side with gauze when his eyes fluttered open. He watched me, his gaze hazy with pain but sharp, analytical. He watched my hands moving with a competence he hadn't expected. "You should have run," he rasped, his voice rough. I met his eyes, my own reflecting the dim light of the medical lamp. "Where would I go?" I asked softly. It was the truth. His enemies knew who I was now. My old life was gone. My world was this room, this man bleeding on a table, the smell of antiseptic and blood. I had crossed a line I could not uncross. By helping him, by cleaning his wounds and hiding us here, I had become an accessory, a part of his world, a morally gray act I couldn't take back. He reached up, his hand surprisingly strong, and caught my wrist. His skin was hot. "Having you here," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a confession dragged from him by pain and proximity. "It is a complication I did not account for." The tension confession. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous, more honest. He was a man who accounted for everything. I was his one variable, his one mistake. And in that moment, that felt more intimate than any pretty lie. "I'm a fast learner," I whispered back, my fingers still pressed against his side, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Over the next few days, the house in the hills became our world. A gilded cage where I nursed him back to a semblance of health. The silence between us was different now. It was not empty, but filled with a shared trauma and a fragile, unspoken understanding. I would catch him watching me, his expression unreadable. I would find myself tracing the lines of a new scar on his shoulder, a permanent reminder of the choice he'd made on that roof. We learned each other in the quiet moments. I learned he drank his tea black, that he slept with a gun on the nightstand, and that nightmares haunted his sleep, making him cry out a name that wasn't mine. He learned that I wasn't fragile, that I could handle the sight of blood, and that my quiet presence seemed to soothe the ghosts that walked with him. The enemy had made their move, and they had failed. But they had also learned his weakness. They knew he had shielded me. They had a new target. The threat was no longer just about his empire. It had become personal.
It was about me.
The final confrontation came a week later. We thought we were safe. Ji-hoon was still recovering, moving stiffly, but the lethal edge had returned to his eyes. He was on the phone, pacing the length of the living room's glass wall, his voice low and menacing as he gave orders. I was in the kitchen making tea when I saw it. A small red, dancing on the center of his chest. A laser sight. A sniper. There was no time to scream, no time to think. I acted. I threw the hot ceramic teapot in his direction. It wasn't aimed at him, but at the glass wall beside him. "Get down," I yelled. The teapot shattered against the bulletproof glass with a loud crack, the hot tea splashing everywhere. The shock of it made him drop, breaking his line of sight with the sniper just as the first shot hit the window, creating a spiderweb crack, but not breaking through. The element of surprise was ours, but only for a second. The attack was a diversion. While our attention was on the sniper, his rivals were breaching the house's perimeter. Mr. Choi's voice crackled over an intercom. There inside, Ji-hoon grabbed me, pulling me toward the reinforced steel of the central staircase. He was still weak, his movements not as fluid as they should be. He shoved a small pistol into my hand. "You know how to use this?" I nodded numbly, another skill learned in a life that had prepared me for the worst. He looked at me, his eyes dark and intense. "Stay behind me." But I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that car dealership. I wasn't a passive piece in his game anymore. As he engaged the first two men who came up the stairs, I saw another one slipping around, trying to flank him. Ji-hoon was pinned down, his injury making him a fraction of a second too slow. He wouldn't see the man in time. I raised the gun, my hands trembling, but my aim steady. I fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man flanking Ji-hoon dropped. I had shot someone. I had saved him. The fight was brutal and short. Ji-hoon and his men were ruthlessly efficient. When it was over, the silence that descended was heavier than the gunfire had been. The house was a wreck, the scent of cordite hanging in the air.
Ji-hoon came to me.
He ignored his men, his wounds, the bodies on the floor. He walked straight to me and took the gun from my trembling hands. He looked from my face to the man I had shot and then back again. There was a cost paid. The last piece of my old self, the woman who had never crossed that line, was gone. He gently took my chin in his hand, forcing me to look at him. His acknowledgement of what I was to him was no longer deniable, no longer hidden. "They came for you because you are mine," he said, his voice low and absolute. A claim. A promise. I will burn their world to ash for it. It wasn't soft.
It wasn't romantic.
It was the most terrifying and possessive declaration I had ever heard. And in the ruins of our safe house, surrounded by the evidence of his violent world, I felt a tremor of something that wasn't fear. It was belonging. Weeks later, the war was over. Ji-hoon had been true to his word. His response had been swift, silent, and total. His rivals were erased, their empires dismantled, their names spoken only in whispers. A calm had settled over our lives, but it was the calm of a graveyard. Peace bought with blood. We moved back to the penthouse, which had been scrubbed of any evidence of our frantic departure. It was the same, but we were different. The space between us had vanished. One evening, I stood on the balcony, looking out at the endless sea of city lights. The night air was cool on my skin. I didn't hear him approach, but I felt his presence, a familiar warmth at my back. He came to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the distant, silent crawl of traffic. Nothing in this world was free, and we had both paid a steep price for this quiet moment. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, a firm, possessive grip. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, a truth. This was my life now. I had walked into a world of polished steel and tailored violence, and instead of running, I had learned its language. I had made a choice on that rooftop in that safe house, and with that gunshot, I chose him. I squeezed his hand, a silent answer that he understood completely. The city glowed below us, a beautiful, dangerous empire that was now ours.